So think of the state of mind of James and John, the disciples. We read in Luke 9, the Samaritans did not receive Jesus because his face was set for the journey to Jerusalem. And when his disciples James and John saw this, they said, Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them just as Elijah did? So, what are the qualities that make for healthy community? Whether it's the life of a congregation, a business team, a group of volunteers working together on a project. Many of us have had the experience of finding it hard to work sometimes with even just one or two other people. What is it that draws us together, and what is it that can separate us? The story of James and John's reaction is one of the qualities that can tend to separate us. These two disciples were outraged that the Samaritan village did not accept Jesus. They had a conviction and maybe a cockiness that they were in the right. Jesus had become quite popular. Shortly after this story, Jesus was going to send out 70 disciples in pairs to prepare the way in many different villages throughout the land of Judea and Galilee. The disciples had seen the Lord's power. They had heard his teaching. They had a sense, we're right and they're wrong. And because the Samaritan people had rejected the Lord, James and John thought they were justified in calling fire down from heaven. They cite Elijah calling fire down from heaven. This comes from the second book of Kings, where the king of Israel had fallen and hurt himself and was sending to find out whether he would recover through going to the god of the Philistines. Elijah met the messengers and sent them back. And when the king realized that Elijah is the one who said that he would not live, he sent a captain and 50 soldiers. That captain said, "Come down." And Elijah responded, "If I am a man of God, then let fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50 men." That happened. A second captain and 50 came and said, "Come down quickly." And Elijah said the same words, and he and his 50 were consumed. So this seems to be an example of Elijah seeing somebody as inappropriate, commanding a prophet of the Lord, and a consequence came. Now, the teachings for the new church state that the people of the Samaritan village do indeed represent an opposition to what's good and true. They represent false ideas or doctrine that tends to reject the Lord. This state of mind occurs in many parts of life. Picture a 6-year-old with a firmly set face saying that he was quite justified in hitting a playmate. Now, a 6-year-old can't reject the Lord the way an adult can, but still that state of mind is one that's in opposition to what's good and true. Or picture somebody who has drifted into an apathetic state about a really important part of life. Maybe his marriage, his job, his friendships, because he doesn't think it's going to make any difference what he does. Or a third example, picture somebody who is rescuing another adult from the consequences of their behavior. And it's not so much that they're concerned for what's good for the other person as they can't stand to see that other person experience the consequences. In each of these cases, people are getting in the way of the Lord's presence. They're not standing up for what they can do to make this world a better place. They're like the Samaritan village rejecting the Lord. Now, we know we can't really know what's in another person's heart, but we can tell from the words they use, expression, tone of voice, their actions, that some things they're doing are good and some aren't good. And our mind can tend to pigeonhole or label each of these. We can look at this set of words and deeds and actions and make one judgment, and we can look at another one and make a different judgment. Perhaps we tend to say, that's evil or really bad, that's sort of bad, that's sort of good, that's genuinely good. Now, obviously in this story, James and John have decided that the people of the Samaritan village are bad, and they deserve to be punished. They thought that destruction by fire of heaven was justified. Now, it's interesting that it's James and John who represent this state, or the ones who speak these words. Because consistently, in the internal sense, we're told that James and John represent charity or a wise kindness and all the good things somebody does from that wise kindness. So, why is it James and John, who seem to represent this good thing, are the very ones that are calling for fire from heaven? A reality about the way our mind works is that on our path to spiritual life, we begin by doing and saying good things with a sense that we're doing it ourselves. We take credit for it. And because we sense, I chose this and I deserve credit for it, we tend to look down on others who aren't measuring up, can very easily condemn them. And this state has a contempt within it. This state of mind is described in the following teaching for the new church. The doctrine of many churches teaches that we cannot earn credit by the good we do, because the good we do is not ours, but the Lord's. They know that the issue of credit directs attention to the person, and accordingly join forces with self-love and with thoughts of superiority, and therefore with contempt for others. When we reflect on this story, we could see that James and John would be condemned by their own judgment. They too were rejecting the Lord and what is good and justifying it with false ideas. Their idea that people who didn't immediately accept the Lord should be condemned was false. In the order of creation, evil does bring its own consequences, and sometimes we have a hand in bringing them, such as a judge who condemns somebody who's broken the law. But what the Lord hopes is that within that condemnation, there's either a desire that the individual might learn and live a better life, or that the broader community be protected by the judgment. There's never a desire to hurt. And even in that story of Elijah calling down fire, it seems as though he's saying, if I'm a man of God, this consequence will happen. Not so much that he was sending it himself. Good people in this world should wish well to others, even when they're not doing the right things. When James and John spoke the words to Jesus, I think there's some indication that when Jesus had heard that the Samaritan village wasn't going to accept them, he turned and started on the pathway to another village. And it seems as though James and John came up behind him. and said their words, saying, "Shall we command fire from heaven?" And they got a strong response from Jesus. Jesus turned and rebuked them and said, "You do not know what manner of spirit you are of. For the Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them." The part of our mind that tends to divide our experiences up into different categories has wonderful strengths and very strong weaknesses. This part of our mind is what we refer to as our understanding. It can work like a surgeon's scalpel, dissecting our experiences into identifiable and labeled parts. This cutting up of experience is necessary. It's the way we understand. Listen to this following passage from the Teachings for the New Church. A human being is unable to have an idea of one without first of all having the idea of several. For that which is a single whole with a person is formed from several parts, or what amounts to the same, things existing simultaneously come into being consecutively. It's the way our mind works. Before we can see a whole, we need to recognize the parts and then see the connection and bring them together. We just don't understand things without first recognizing their parts. But cutting up and labeling our experiences has the same destructive effect as dissection has in a biology lab. It destroys the very thing that makes for life. Left to ourselves, our understanding will tend to divide the world up into tinier and tinier pieces. We can feel like there aren't very many people like us ourselves as we look at the differences with other people. They make choices we wouldn't make, and we can feel relatively isolated. Considering the vast number of peoples in this world, we could think of the life of this church organization and feel very tiny and very isolated. But even within the life of this congregation, the intellectual scalpel of our understanding can so divide us up into different segments or groups, it makes the possibility of unified action seem futile. This dividing up comes because the way we tend to look at things at first just sees the outside or the external, as described in this passage. For those people who are confined to what is external, devoid of anything internal, do not look on the internal aspect of the church in any other way. They give the name of falsity to what is true, and the name of truth to that which is false. They do so for the reason that being confined to what is external does not enable anyone to see whether something is false or true. Only what is internal makes this possible. Internal sight is a necessary ability which can make judgments about things seen in external sight. To make such judgments, internal sight must be fully in the light of heaven. But it's not in the light of heaven unless the person has faith in the Lord, and this faith leads that person to read the Word. Looking at the outside and not seeing within it, we don't recognize what's going on. Most of us know that when you've got a cranky, tired little toddler, you don't judge him for some of the words that come out of his mouth. And yet, sometimes when we're dealing with an adult who is also cranky and tired, we hold them completely responsible for what they say because we're looking at the external and saying, that's not right. We're not seeing the state that it comes from. The thinking part of our mind separates from good or love, and it divides things up. Love, or a sight of the internal, is what joins things together. Consider this fundamental definition of the nature of true love. In its essence, love is to love others outside of itself, to desire to be one with them, and to render them blessed from oneself. So love has these qualities. Wants somebody to love, wants to be one with them, and wants them to be happy. Love and its accompanying desire for accomplishing what is useful is what joins together angels in heaven. As stated in the final lesson, if all, no matter how many, are governed by charity or mutual love, they have but one end in view, namely the common good, the Lord's kingdom, and the Lord himself. Another passage speaks of the spiritual laws that produce this unity. Heaven consists of myriads of angelic communities, and yet the Lord leads them as one angel or as one human being. The reason for this is that among all there is mutual love from the love of the Lord. When this love is among all and in all, then all can be disposed into a heavenly form, which is such that many are a one. And the more in number they are, the more strongly they are a one. In order to have this unity, we need to have the Lord's love growing within our hearts. We need to see below the surface of apparently different externals that would tend to separate us from others and at times condemn them. When a group of people is discussing something, we can listen to the different voices and we can think, now, I really think that's a good idea. Well, that's not such a good idea. We can even have somebody say something that we think, I just don't think that's right. And sometimes we can have the idea that things would be better if we could just silence the voices that we don't think have good ideas. But would we really be better off without that variety of voices? Without realizing the different qualities that should come together to make the most useful decision? If one person was silenced, would the group be better off? The Lord encourages us to recognize that a variety of people working together is a more perfect whole. The chorus of voices can help us better see what is useful. I strongly see this to be true with the life of this congregation. James and John thought that the Samaritan village should be consumed by fire from heaven. This is not the spirit that the Lord wants to foster within our hearts and minds and lives. He would lead us to recognize that we're all his children. He would lead us to see in which ways that by working together with many backgrounds, strengths, and motivations that exist within each of us, we can be blessed, and from unified action, we can help bring the Lord's kingdom more fully into this world. This will take effort. Will take seeing more deeply. Will take a growing love for what is useful and a growing love for what the Lord wants. Amen.